Many churchy words grace our lips, but elude our understanding. If you've been around the church forever, or only visited once, there were probably words that left you scratching your head, maybe even feeling a little dumb. During this 4-week series, with all our campuses combined at Woldumar Nature Center, we'll unpack 4 important churchy words: faith, confession, gospel, and salvation.
Well, peace, friends. Thank you. As you know, as Mikkel said, my name is Nathan White. I do happen to be her husband. And I want to actually start by sharing a little bit of information that going you didn't know, maybe you did know, that today is Mikkel's birthday. So I'm not going to lead us in a chorus of happy birthday because I would like to go home this afternoon. So, but I do want to say happy birthday to Mikkel, and may this sermon be a present and not a curse to you. But I want to start by sharing a story from our family. About 6 years ago, we went down to New Orleans to visit my aunt and uncle and cousins. It was a family reunion on my mom's side of the family. And it's really important to know when we get together on my mom's side of the family, we have a lot of fun. So there was a jambalaya versus smoked turkey competition, and you can guess everyone won in that one. We went down to the French Quarter, to Café Du Mont, and we had little powdered sugar fights from the beignets, right? If you've been there, y'all, I had more fun throwing sugar than eating it. But we did a 5-mile turkey trot, and we just did a lot of really fun things on this trip. But that wasn't the whole of the trip. There was a part of this trip that was also really, really sobering. On our way back to North Carolina, Mikkel and I took the opportunity to stop in Montgomery, Alabama, where we had been wanting to visit the Legacy Museum and the Memorial for Peace and Justice. And this is from this work originated from a guy named Brian Stevenson, who wrote the book Just Mercy. And this group that he founded, Equal Justice Initiative, advocates for the legal support of those who have found themselves on death row. So, back to the Legacy Museum and the Memorial for Peace and Justice. I'm not going to say a lot about the Legacy Museum this morning. I'm going to focus a little bit more on the Memorial for Peace and Justice, but I do want to say the Legacy Museum is worth a Google. So if you want to write that down, maybe this is a good thing to do. The Legacy Museum is about the history of slavery and mass incarceration in the United States and how they're really pretty entangled. And it is a sobering thing to look at. But the Memorial for Peace and Justice, which is also there, is where we spent a lot of our time. So this is our nation's first comprehensive memorial dedicated to the legacy of Black Americans who were victims of extrajudicial killings, which is a way of saying that they were lynched. Over 4,400 Black Americans were killed in racial terror between 1877 and 1950. You can already feel how this is a little more sobering than the jambalaya, right? But at this monument, they had these steel monuments hung from the ceiling, and there were over 800 of them. And on these monuments were the names of people they knew were victims of racial terror. Again, sobering is the word that comes to mind. When I think about it, I remember standing in front of this wall of jars. And these jars had dirt from all of the different known places where lynchings occurred. And I remember thinking and remembering, even back to beginning of Genesis, there's a story of Cain and Abel. Perhaps you're familiar with it. If not, that's okay. But there's a moment where God says to Cain, "What have you done? Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." And it's a sobering reality of what that is and of the history of our nation. Then outside of the center of the museum, they had doubles of all of these 800 monuments. They were laid out, and counties were invited to come and take one of those monuments back to their own county and to place it up somewhere as a way to remember and take ownership of the reality of what happened in their county. And since 2015, EJI has supported more than 80 counties in erecting these monuments where they, in a prominent place in their county. So it's a little over 10%, right? It's a slow step towards healing. Now you may be wondering, why would anyone put so much time into this kind of monument? Like, what's the point in reliving that history so much? What's the point in bringing up that past? Well, this is what EJI has to say about their work. They say publicly confronting the truth of our history is the first step towards recovery and reconciliation. Publicly confronting the truth of our history is the first step towards recovery and reconciliation. See, EJI's work takes the first step to publicly confront the truth, but there's a second step where those responsible come and take ownership, so the counties can come and take those monuments. Now, this isn't the end-all be-all of healing. It doesn't solve the problems. It doesn't erase the damage that's still there, but it's forward progress. It is moving towards healing. So we continued on our trip. We went back from Montgomery to North Carolina, and we felt this really big rift in our hearts, right? We felt the joy of all these fun moments. I remember Liam in a glass elevator for the first time, like, plastered, like, what? Like, he's having so much fun. And I remember scanning the bayou for alligators at my uncle's house. Like, there's these really fun moments, and all that we just learned at this museum. So the juxtaposition of these two realities left us really kind of confused and conflicted. And if you're like me, maybe you've been in a place like that before. Maybe you've felt that. Because the reality is all of us are surrounded by both beautiful things and moments of failure and kind of horrific things in the world. So one of the things we do here at Sycamore Creek, you may be familiar with this, is we take some time to chat about what we're learning. So I have a question for you to process with your neighbor. You'll get about 90 seconds. So maybe introduce yourself if you don't know each other, but then what I want you to do is share an experience, or answer this question, right? Where have you experienced a contrast of something being joyful and sobering? So take 90 seconds and talk about it. All right. Hopefully you got a chance to maybe meet someone new or find out if they go to one of the other campuses, or perhaps if they're new to Sycamore Creek. But I want to kind of continue us on with our message. So as you know, we're going through a series called Churchy Words, where we're taking a deep dive into these 4 different words that are commonly used by churches, but maybe they don't have a common understanding of what those words mean. So the words are faith, confession, gospel, and salvation. And today, I get the joy of talking about confession. I gotta say, out of the 4 of them, I'm looking at you, pastors. Anyway, no, it's okay. I did. We got this. But anyway, so confession, though, like, is a hard one sometimes to think about having a conversation about. Like, how do we do this? Because for some of us, confession carries some baggage. And I'm not talking about like a fanny pack. I'm talking about like a couple trolleys of baggage, right? Like, it's a lot that comes to mind when we think about confession. But I believe, and I've experienced this, that confession, when we move towards it, in an invitation to who God is, it does bring liberation and freedom, and it brings joy and life. So my proposal today is that we move towards confession together. We're going to spend some time reflecting on King David's words in Psalm 32. But first I want to lay a little bit of groundwork. So confession carries some baggage, and perhaps for some of us we're feeling this defensiveness or avoidance that comes up when this topic happens, because confession can hurt. And in reality, confession has been used to hurt, has been used to manipulate, and in cases has been used to blackmail some of us. And that's painful and bad, and not how it should be. It's not God's dream for us. So if you're like me, you hear the word confession, and you immediately, like, your mind goes to sin. What is sin? Like, how am I sinning? Are there things I'm sinning that I don't know I'm sinning in? Like, all of that kind of run of the reel in my head happens very fast. But if you're like me, you probably grew up in a house, or perhaps grew up in a place where you heard from an early age that everyone is born sinful, which, if you unpack that further, means that all people are evil. Inherently, you and I are evil. That's maybe a faith that you heard growing up. Well, friends, just a quick glimmer of hope. Like, I don't believe that's actually God's heart for us. right? That's a faith understanding that many of us are taught, but it is a faith understanding many of us have the opportunity to heal from. Hopefully we can do that today. So Meredith Miller is an author who wrote, she's been in children's ministry for a long time. She wrote a book called Woven, and it's subtitled, Giving Your Children a Faith They Don't Need to Heal From. Giving your children a faith they don't need to hear from. I see like some parents like, oh, let me write this one down. It's good, it's good. But here's what she has to say about sin. Here's how she frames it. So she says, God dreams of a world that works in a way that matches who God is. So a loving God would hope that the world is loving. A patient God would hope that people respond with patience. So then think of the opposite of who God is. If God is loving and patient, the opposite would be hateful and impatient. Sin is the way the world works that keeps it from matching who God is. It's the way people have behaved where they only look out for themselves, and it's the systems that keep people from having what they need. Sin is what the world looks like when it's the opposite of who God is. So I just want to highlight one of the things she mentioned is that sin is individual and collective. For many of us, it's easy to think about like the individual ways that we don't live in alignment with God's dream for the world, but it is also collective and communal, and there are ways that we need to consider how we might confess and move towards healing in those spaces too. So it is individual and collective. So I want to just take a quick minute, and with that framework of thinking of sin is the opposition of God's dream for the world, take a moment to reflect on what does that look like in your life. Now turn and tell your neighbor. I'm just kidding, that's not a chat question. Again, I want to go home this afternoon, right? So that would be a terrible chat question. That's an example of the baggage that comes with it. But it is worth reflecting on, right? Like, how in our lives are we perhaps living in opposition? Sorry, I'm seeing some people take deep breaths. That was not great. But like, yeah, how perhaps have you been living in opposition to God's dream for the world is a question worth reflecting on. So if you're like me, maybe as a parent, what that looks like is that you're sometimes a little impatient with your children. No show of hands required, I get it. Or maybe you're a little less generous with your resources than you think you should be. Or maybe you participate in systems like rampant consumerism or gentrification. Or maybe you live a life of avoidance, where you remove yourself from opportunities to be a part of helping the world become the way that God dreamed it would be. Like, there's lots of ways in which we live outside of God's dream for the world. Now, I will say acknowledging sin in this way is really difficult. I've yet to find anyone who enjoys acknowledging sin or brokenness in their own life. If you have, please talk to one of our pastors. But it can be difficult, it can be overwhelming, and we can sometimes feel like we don't know what to do. I've often felt that. But again, today, I'm proposing that we continue to move towards confession, because just because something is difficult doesn't mean it's not good. At its core, confession is acknowledgement. We need to commit to not ignoring or hiding from ourselves, from our failures, from the systems that are broken in this world. And we need to take responsibility for what we've done, because at its core, confession is just truth-telling. Confession is also necessary for liberation. Remember what EJI said, that confronting the truth is the first step towards healing. Confessing and confronting the truth of sin is the first step towards that healing for us, for those around us, for the communities we live in, for the world. So what are some of the things that keep us from confession? I know we have at least 5. There's probably more, but we can start with 5. Some of those things that keep us from confession start with defensiveness. And this can look like, well, it wasn't that bad. Like, what I didn't say wasn't that bad. I mean, I didn't do what Mark did. I'm just kidding. You know, like, there's this defensiveness that happens. Or shame, right? Like, shame is my personal favorite. I don't like that it's my personal favorite, but it's what I do. Like, this belief that if I actually acknowledge what I did, like, that means I'm actually, like, so irreparably damaged that there's something really, really wrong with me. Fear is another common one, and that's really often about relationship. But it's like, if I take ownership of this, if I do, will people abandon me? Will I be left alone? Will I be forsaken? Guilt, another thing that keeps us, is the idea that if we take responsibility, then we have to like repair. We're responsible to do the work to repair, and that feels overwhelming and insurmountable because some of the problems of our communities and in our own lives are bigger than what we can solve. And the last one's pride. And that's the idea of like, admitting failure is a vulnerability, and I don't do that. It's not who I am. Not happening, right? Like, that was a bit of a caricature, but perhaps we've seen that in ourselves or other people. These are 5 common things. Well, I'm just going to jump real quick to a story to share a little bit about my own life. So I grew up in the middle of nowhere, and my parents ran a small country store. There it is, Sugar Tree Country Store. I spent many, many hours there. We sold maple syrup that we made apple butter, and we sold other things, but it was really like a country store, like a little mercantile maybe, which meant that we didn't have the good stuff. We didn't have Dr. Pepper, we didn't have candy bars, and we didn't have Hot Pockets. You guys know what I'm talking, like, yes, Hot Pockets. Hot Pockets were a thing. So, but just down the road, about 300 feet down the road, there was a store called Stonewall Grocery, named after Stonewall Jackson. That's a whole conversation I can have with you on the side later. But they had pepperoni pizza, they had ham and cheese, we think it's cheese, and they had cheeseburger, Hot Pockets, and they were like in the little fridge right next to the microwave. So I had to wait 90 seconds from when I opened that thing and put it in the microwave. I would run and pay for it, and I would come back. Only 90 seconds until I could have that perfect bite of a Hot Pocket. You know, the one that scalds the roof of your mouth? Yep. But we knew it was okay because the next bite was going to be frozen. So, like that's the kind of Hot Pocket. Yeah, that's really what it was. So. Anyway, I spent a lot of time at my parents' store, and at some point I learned how to open the cash register. And I was observant enough to know that I shouldn't take the dollar bills. I'll just take the quarters. Mom doesn't count the quarters at night when she reconciles the cash register. So over the course of a few years, I had many Hot Pockets at the unknowing expense of my parents. So at some point, though, it did hit me that this was not okay, and I really needed to stop at night. Just stop doing this, and I probably should tell my parents about it. But I was frozen in fear. I was like, oh no, man, I'm gonna have to mow the yard for 17 years, right? Like, I'm gonna be in a lot of trouble. And in you know, as much as my brain was developed at that time, a fear of abandonment felt very real. So I found myself frozen by fear, guilt, and shame. The beauty of confession, though, kind of stepping out of the story, the beauty of confession is that it pulls us in the opposite direction of fear, guilt, and shame. It pulls us out of those spaces so that we can move towards the love of our God. I gotta hold my thumb on this thing. Okay. Sorry, friends, this is a newbie mistake where I let go of my spot in the notes. Okay, so again, confession pulls us out of fear, guilt, and shame. It moves us towards the loving God. Confession is a gift that we often forfeit because we're trying to hide. We're trying to sweep something under the rug, and we end up in this place where we're entangled with loneliness, agony, and pain. None of these are God's dream for us or God's dream for the world. We need hope. We need to believe that on the other side of confession there is healing. We need to believe that it is worth moving forward here. Because confession is the liberating practice of acknowledging our sin and moving away from shame, fear, and pride towards God's forgiving love. It's acknowledging our sin and moving away from fear, shame, and pride towards God's forgiving love. So another story, micro story real quick. I went to Virginia Tech, and one time I went caving with a bunch of my friends up in the mountains of Virginia. There's not much there. And we got into this cave, we were having fun. We decided to split off into 2 groups because we had different areas we wanted to explore. Long story short, I was in the group that decided, or that wasn't experienced, and we weren't looking behind us to see what the exit would look like on our way out. So fast forward, lots of exploration, then we get into this really big room, and suddenly we don't know how to get out. We're can't find the space to exit. So we've been in there for about an hour, and there's a direct correlation to the amount of time we're spending and the amount of fear, panic, and anxiety that we're feeling. And this is before LED lights, so our flashlights had, maybe an hour worth of life. Like, we had a time span here. But finally, my friend Chris found the way out. It was through this tiny little hole. You had to go down in a crevice and then curve and go. I can't do it today, but you had to get out this tiny little hole. It was dark and scary, and we weren't sure if it would lead us there, but it did. Right? We got out and we moved out of the cave, and our anxieties began to lessen. We began to feel more whole and more safe again. And at the mouth of the cave, we met our friends, and they embraced us with hugs. I've never been more thankful to be in the dark on the side of a mountain in the middle of the night than not being in the earth anymore. So definitely a preference. I don't know that I haven't done that kind of caving since. But that story reminds me of what confession is like. Confession is like sometimes not being 100% sure if this is going to lead us out, and it's going to be scary and unnerving and dark, and you might have to hold your breath a little bit. But through that, you can find liberation and healing, and it is really good. Now, some of you are probably wondering if my parents ever found out that I was taking the money for the Hot Pockets, or if they're learning about it on the live stream. I did confess to them. I will admit it took me until college, and I confessed that among a number of other things I'm not going to put in a sermon illustration. But I confessed it, and I remember the words of my mom when she says, "Nathan, of course we forgive you. We love you. You're our kid." And I just why did I wait so long carrying that shame, right? I had a belly full of Hot Pockets, but a heart full of shame. Why did I carry that for so long when on the other side was that kind of love and acceptance? So this brings us to our next chat question. Have you ever seen or experienced confession as liberating? Now, a little caveat, I'm not asking you to go and share the things that, not the deep things. Share what you're comfortable with. Or share an experience you've observed. But now's a good time to wrestle with that together. So turn and have a conversation about it. Hopefully there's some good conversations happening that you can continue later on today. I want to take us back to Scripture. I promised we were going there at the beginning, and finally we have arrived. I want us to take a look at this example of the journey of confession as we see in the reflections of King David. So King David in Scripture was a man that was said to be a man after God's own heart. Yet, he has also one of probably the most pronounced failures that we see in Scripture. So he was king, and he abused that power to force an affair with a woman named Bathsheba. And then she became pregnant. So next up, to cover it up, David tried calling Bathsheba's husband back home from war so that, the timing worked out and it wouldn't look like David had done anything wrong. Well, that didn't work. So then David, devised and successfully had a plan. Yeah, he executed a plan to have Bathsheba's husband killed. Then went on to marry Bathsheba in order to try to hide all of this. Incredible abuse of power, right? Later, though, David is approached by the prophet Nathan, which led to David's confession. Wait, is this why I'm doing this one? Because it said Nathan? Anyway, just kidding. But no, back to it. David was confronted by Nathan about this confession. So CliffsNotes version of this story is a great reminder that people aren't all good or all bad. Right? We all have incredible capacity for good, and we have incredible capacity to live in opposition to God's dream for the world. There are no heroes in Scripture except for God. So in Psalm 32, we see David reflect on his time of hiding from the reality of his actions. He says, "When I refused to confess my sins, my body wasted away, and I groaned all day long. Day and night, your hand of discipline was heavy on me. My strength evaporated like water in the summer heat." Have you ever experienced something like this? Had that kind of feeling where there's something in your life that's so emotionally heavy that it impacts your body? Right? Withholding truth in this way or hiding has impacts on our body and our soul, as we see here in the works of David. But when David stopped trying to hide, we see that he experiences liberation. So finally, I confessed all my sins to you and stopped trying to hide my guilt. I said to myself, I will confess my rebellion to the Lord, and you forgave me. All my guilt is gone. All my guilt is gone. It's a good word. So here are three realities of confession that can kind of help us frame it a little bit. The first one is that confession is personal, right? This is about taking personal responsibility and receiving God's forgiveness. This confession is a really safe place to bring all of who you are before God into this place where you are fully and already completely loved. Maybe you've heard someone talk about how you can't be fully loved unless you're fully known. Well, you are fully known in God, and you are fully loved. So this confession is a safe space for you. But confession is also not just personal, it is communal, right? Christianity is not a solo endeavor. Like, you can't live out this faith on your own. We need each other. We're built to be in relationship with each other. Now, I want to say, though, a little caveat. This is where a lot of damage has been done in the history of Christian faith. Because we shouldn't just go confess to anyone, right? Like, you shouldn't just pick a random person on the street and be like, hey, I got something I really need to tell you. Can we get a coffee? This is going to be an awkward 20 minutes, but it'll be really good for me, right? Like you got to think about having some wisdom and knowledge when we approach. So perhaps you find yourself asking the question, how do I know who's safe? How do I know who to trust with this thing that I'm carrying? And I don't have an easy answer for that, but I have a starting point. I know Pastor Mikkel, Pastor Tom, Pastor Mark, Pastor Tom Fox, I think he's here somewhere. These are all incredibly safe people who have been living in the embodied love of God and know how to receive and share that love. And that's a great place to start if you have nowhere else to go. Beyond that, I think being in a small group and getting to know your small group leader, those are also going to be safe people to have a conversation like this with. But while we need to use wisdom, while we need to use discernment, while we need to be careful in how we kind of treat ourselves in this journey, we do still want to move forward. Because that brings us to the third point. Confession is good for our souls. David says, oh, what joy for those whose disobedience is forgiven. And then he goes on to say, oh, yes, what joy for those whose record of the Lord is cleared. This idea of what joy is so important, he repeats it twice. Confession is truly good for our souls. There's great joy when we experience forgiveness. And confession is a pathway towards that healing and that forgiveness and that joy. When we're unwilling to address something, as big or small as it may be, it's like having an infected wound that you don't clean. So there's a few medical professionals I know in the room, like Teresa Miller, Bob Elvia Trout. You can ask them if you're other medical professionals. If you have an infected wound and you just leave it covered and you don't get it cleaned, that's not going to have a good health outcome for you, right? That's not a great option. And it's like that when we continue to hide some of the realities that we're struggling with on our own. That's what it's like to avoid confession. So last thing, real quick, I have 3 practical steps for us in the process of confession. The first, I want to say, is to grieve. Grief is not one of those things we tend to run towards, but it is a reality that we endure and experience as humans. We grieve the ways that we've harmed ourselves, that we've harmed God, that we've harmed others. We grieve the ways in which we've participated in systems of harm for our communities as a whole. The second step is for us to acknowledge. Acknowledge is about owning kind of what is ours to own, taking responsibility for our failures, not equivocating or justifying or saying, I'm so sorry that I did this, but if you hadn't done that, then we wouldn't be here. Have you guys had those kind of apologies before? Aren't they wonderful? They just make my day. No, they really don't. They really don't. But that's what it is. Acknowledging is sort of a true acknowledgement built on the empathy that has allowed us to grieve. So starting with grief, we move towards acknowledgement. And the last thing is the step of receiving. And this is to receive the forgiveness and love of God and God's people. God is faithful to forgive us. It says this in Scripture. Like if we confess our sins, that he is faithful to forgive. And his love is steadfast for us. It was there when we started. It's there all throughout. But receiving can be really hard sometimes. But again, what's hard can still be really good. See, at its core, confession is the liberating practice of acknowledging our sin that moves us away from fear, shame, and pride, those things that are not parts of God's dream for the world. And it moves us towards God's forgiving love and his dream for us and the world. So as we wrap up this message, I want to just give us, we're not going to do a chat question. I want to just give us a little bit of time to pause and reflect. Those of you that are internal processes are probably like, thank you. But just a few minutes to reflect. Is there something in your life that you need to confess? Or you can perhaps think about it this, like, is there an area of my life where I'm living outside of God's dream for the world? What should my next step be? So take a few minutes to reflect on that.